The year was 1816, and London wore its winter like a crown of glass, cold, glittering, and merciless. Snow gathered on the grand stone steps of Mayfair's townhouses, while lamplighters moved through the fog like ghosts carrying small suns. Beneath that same pale light, a black carriage stood before the once proud residence of Baron Whitmore. Its windows, once radiant with laughter and music, now flickered with the dull orange glow of candles lit not for celebration but mourning. Inside, the air smelled faintly of wax, dust, and lavender, the scent of endings. Lady Mary Whitmore stood by her father's coffin, her gloved hands clasped in stillness. She had not cried in days. Her father's ruin had been swift, his heart failing on the same night his fortune collapsed. A single miscalculation in the markets, a trusted partner's betrayal, and generations of wealth evaporated like breath on a winter pane. The Whitmore name, once spoken with reverence in drawing-rooms, now drifted through parlors as gossip. Such a shame, they whispered, so beautiful and now quite destitute. As the undertaker's men lifted the coffin, Mary turned her gaze toward the portrait above the mantel, the painted image of herself at 17, dressed in ivory silk, the promise of a glittering debut in her smile. That girl was gone, buried not in the earth but beneath the weight of whispers. She had been trained for grace, not survival, for ballrooms, not employment. Yet the world offered her no mercy. Within a fortnight, creditors arrived at the Whitmore estate like crows. The marble floors echoed with strangers' footsteps. One by one, the servants were dismissed, the furniture auctioned, and the gardens left to frost. Mary kept only a small trunk of her mother's belongings, a ribbon, a worn book of poetry, and a brooch shaped like a crescent moon. When the gates closed for the last time, she did not look back. Her future narrowed to a single offer: employment as a governess to the young niece of the Dowager Duchess of Pembroke. It was the kind of position whispered about among gentlewomen, half respectable, half humiliating. But pride, she told herself, could not be eaten. She arrived at Pembroke House in a modest grey cloak, carrying her trunk and the ghost of her former self. Life as a governess taught her silence. She rose before dawn, tutored the girl in French and Scripture, and dined alone in the small schoolroom while the household above her laughed and dined under crystal chandeliers. Sometimes she would pass a mirror and fail to recognize the pale figure reflected there, the proud baron's daughter now a servant in all but name. But there was grace even in invisibility, and Mary held to it with the quiet dignity of a woman who refused to beg the world for notice. One evening, word reached the house that a royal charity ball was to be held in Grosvenor Square. The Duchess herself received an invitation, and her household stirred with excitement. Dresses were fitted, jewels selected, and every mirror in the upper chambers crowded with women dreaming of admiration. Mary was summoned not to attend, but to chaperone her pupil, ensuring the child behaved until the carriage returned. She accepted the task without protest, though her heart stirred with something between longing and dread. The ballroom was a world of gold and laughter, 1,000 candles mirrored in crystal. Mary stood along the wall, her plain gown of pale blue blending into shadow. The air shimmered with perfume and gossip. She could hear her name whispered once, soft, amused. "Is that not the Whitmore girl? Teaching children now, I hear." The laughter that followed was gentle and cruel, the sort that killed slowly. She turned away, pretending not to hear, her chin held high. Moments later, a small accident turned humiliation into spectacle. As she reached for a fallen ribbon near a candelabrum, her gown brushed too close to the flame. In an instant the hem caught fire, a single flare of orange licking at the fabric. Gasps rippled through the room. Before she could react, a man moved swiftly from the crowd. His gloved hand struck down the flame, his coat shielding her from the sparks. The music stopped. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in black with a silver insignia at his collar, the Duke of Ashbourne. The room seemed to bend around him, as though the chandeliers themselves bowed. His eyes, dark and steady, met hers. "You are unharmed?" His voice was calm, measured, yet something beneath it trembled like the low note of a cello. Mary managed only a whisper. "Yes, Your Grace." He nodded once, still holding her gaze. Then, before the stunned assembly, he bowed, not the casual nod due to a governess, but a deep, courtly bow reserved for ladies of the highest standing. A murmur swept the hall. She stood frozen, her heart hammering, the scent of smoke and roses mingling in her breath. The Duke turned to the musicians and gave a subtle gesture. The violins resumed, the dance continued, yet the balance of the evening had shifted. Wherever Mary moved, she felt the weight of eyes upon her. The whispers began almost at once. Why would he? Perhaps pity. Perhaps interest. And that word, interest, moved like wildfire. When the carriage returned her to Pembroke House, Mary sat in silence, staring out at the frozen streets. She should have felt gratitude, even relief. Instead, confusion tangled with fear. The Duke of Ashbourne was a man of immense power and privilege, counselor to the Prince Regent, owner of vast estates, and widower of a woman who had been London's envy. Men like him did not notice women like her. Yet he had bowed as though before an equal. In her small attic room, she removed her scorched gown and folded it carefully, as though it were silk spun from memory. The faint burn at the hem glowed against the lamplight. She pressed her hand to her chest, trying to still the storm there. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and relentless. In the silence, she thought of the Duke's eyes, how they had not looked through her, but at her, as though he recognized something she had long forgotten existed. For the first time in years, Mary felt the ache of possibility, fragile and frightening. But with it came the sharper edge of fear. The world she lived in did not forgive such moments. Tomorrow, gossip would twist kindness into scandal. Tomorrow, the name Whitmore would once again echo in drawing-rooms, this time as a story of a governess and a duke. As the candle guttered low, Mary whispered to herself a truth she dared not voice aloud. It would have been better if he had not seen me. Yet beneath that quiet resignation, a spark, small and treacherous, refused to die. The city slept, cloaked in frost and rumor. And somewhere in a grand house across the square, the Duke of Ashbourne stood by his window, remembering the governess whose eyes had met his without fear. Neither knew it yet, but the night's small fire had already set a far greater one alight, one that would burn through pride, reputation, and the careful order of their world. The days following the charity ball unfolded with a strange stillness, as though London itself held its breath. In Pembroke House, nothing was spoken directly, yet everything was known. The servants exchanged glances. The Duchess's tone grew clipped and measured. Even the child under Mary's care seemed to sense the invisible weight pressing upon her governess's shoulders. Mary moved through her lessons with steady composure, but inside her mind, the image of that moment, the Duke's gloved hand striking out the flame, his eyes fixed upon hers, played again and again with merciless clarity. She scolded herself for the weakness of remembering. It had meant nothing, she told herself. He had acted from duty, not affection. Men of his rank performed gestures of chivalry as they might tip a hat or lift a glass of wine, habitually, without consequence. But consequence, it seemed, had already begun its quiet work. 3 mornings after the ball, a footman approached her with a small parcel bound in cream paper and sealed with black wax. The insignia was unmistakable, a falcon and crown, the crest of the Duke of Ashbourne. Mary froze, her heart quickening in disbelief. "Who sent this?" she asked. The footman only bowed. "It was delivered by hand, my lady." She took the parcel to her chamber and locked the door before breaking the seal. Inside lay a delicate silver locket, polished to a mirror's gleam. When she opened it, she found no portrait within, only a single word engraved in fine cursive: courage. For a long moment she simply stared. Then, as though the meaning were too sharp to bear, she closed the locket and pressed it to her palm. It was beautiful, yes, but also dangerous. A gift from a duke to a governess was not kindness, it was invitation. It risked not only her position but her reputation, already fragile as frost. She resolved at once to return it. Yet even as she whispered her decision, her heart trembled with something she dared not name. The following day, she requested an audience with the Dowager Duchess, hoping to discreetly hand the token back. The Duchess received her with the distant politeness of a woman who had lived long enough to find most things tiresome. Mary explained softly that an item had come into her possession by mistake. The Duchess's gaze sharpened, curious. "Mistake," she repeated. Mary hesitated, then placed the locket upon the table between them. "It bears the seal of His Grace, the Duke of Ashbourne. I believe it was intended elsewhere." The Duchess studied the object for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she smiled faintly, a smile without warmth. "You are wise to return it," she said. "The world rarely forgives a woman for being noticed by a man of power." By evening, word had already spread through the household. The Duke had sent a trinket to the governess. The governess had refused it. Some found it gallant, others scandalous. Servants whispered in corridors, and one of the Duchess's guests was overheard saying, "Perhaps she intends to appear virtuous before surrendering." Mary heard these words by accident, passing a half-open door. Her cheeks burned, though she said nothing. She had been judged before. She would endure it again. Yet something inside her had changed. The memory of that locket, the word courage, had taken root like a hidden seed. A week later, the Duchess hosted a small gathering in her garden, a winter luncheon for a circle of peers too important to decline. The sky was pale and brittle, the air scented faintly of smoke from nearby hearths. Mary guided her young pupil through the crowd, careful to remain unobtrusive. She had almost succeeded when she felt a stillness in the air, a subtle awareness that made her turn. Across the white gravel path, standing beside the fountain, was the Duke of Ashbourne. He was dressed not in court finery but in a dark overcoat, his hair dusted faintly with snow. Their eyes met. Mary's breath caught. She lowered her gaze at once, but it was too late. He had seen her. He began to walk toward her, not hurriedly, not stealthily, but with the calm certainty of a man unaccustomed to doubt. When he reached her, he inclined his head with impeccable courtesy. "Miss Whitmore," he said softly, using the title due her birth rather than her station. "You received my token?" Mary forced composure into her voice. "I did, Your Grace, and I returned it. I thank you for your kindness, but it would be improper for me to accept such a gift." The faintest trace of a smile touched his lips. "Improper," he repeated. "Perhaps. But not unworthy." She met his gaze despite herself. "You mistake me, sir. My place is not among those who can afford such gestures." "I do not mistake you," he said, his tone low, carrying beneath the hum of conversation around them. "I know precisely where you stand, and what it cost you to remain standing." The words unsettled her more than flattery ever could. Before she could reply, a woman's voice rang across the garden, a clear, sharp tone of social command. "Your Grace, you honor us with your presence." The Duchess herself approached, smiling too widely. Mary stepped back at once, bowing her head, but the Duke's gaze lingered on her for one fraction too long. In that instant the Duchess saw everything. That night the city buzzed with speculation. By morning the scandal was born. The Duke of Ashbourne pays court to a fallen lady employed as a governess. It appeared in whispers first, then in letters, then in the parlors of women who thrived on ruin. Men laughed, women pitied. Some called it a romantic folly, others a disgrace. The Duchess of Pembroke, mortified, summoned Mary to her chambers before breakfast. "I will not have this house turned into gossip fodder," she said, her voice sharp as cut glass. "You must understand, Miss Whitmore, that propriety is the armor of our world. Without it, even virtue becomes suspect." Mary stood with folded hands, silent. "You will leave for the countryside," the Duchess continued. "My sister in Hampshire requires a tutor for her grandsons. You will depart tomorrow. It is for your own good." "For her own good." The phrase echoed like a verdict. Mary curtsied and thanked her employer with outward calm, though her heart felt as if it had splintered. She returned to her room and packed her few belongings. On the small desk lay a folded handkerchief, the one she had used to wrap the locket before returning it. To her astonishment, the locket was there again, the wax seal broken, the word courage gleaming in the lamplight. Someone had placed it there while she worked. For a moment she simply stood, the quiet ticking of the clock the only sound. She did not know if it was an apology, a plea, or a farewell. But as she lifted the locket and closed her fingers around it, warmth spread through her chest, defying the cold certainty of exile. The next morning, before dawn, a carriage carried her away from London. She watched the city's spires recede behind grey mist, the streets glistening with melted frost. Somewhere, in one of those grand houses, the Duke of Ashbourne would be waking to a day of consequence and privilege. She tried to believe he would forget her, that she would fade like a dream once daylight returned. Yet as the carriage rolled southward, she touched the locket at her throat and knew, with a quiet dread, that forgetting would not come easily. What began as scandal had already become something far more perilous, a memory she could not put away, and a man who, despite every boundary of rank and reason, would not let her vanish without a trace. Rain fell in relentless threads across the Hampshire countryside, turning the roads to silver ribbons beneath the storm. Inside the modest vicarage, Lady Merry Whitmore sat near the hearth, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea gone cold. Months had passed since she had left London, yet the city's echoes refused to quiet within her. The laughter, the whispers, the sudden stillness of the ballroom when the Duke's hand brushed hers, all returned in the solitude of her new life. She had built a quiet routine teaching the vicar's children, finding a fragile peace in their innocence. The world had shrunk to this small village, where no one knew her name, and she preferred it that way. Peace, after all, was a form of survival. That evening, as thunder rumbled in the distance, the youngest child asked her to tell a story before bed. Mary smiled and obliged, her voice gentle as she spoke of kings and knights, of courage and honor. Yet as she spoke the word courage, her gaze drifted to the silver locket she wore still, though she told herself it was only sentiment that made her keep it. When the children were asleep, she sat by the window watching the storm. It was there, through the wavering candlelight, that she saw the carriage lights approaching through the rain. At first she thought it a dream. No one traveled this late, not on such a night. But as the wheels stopped before the gate, a figure stepped out, cloaked and unmistakable. Her heart faltered. The Duke of Ashbourne had found her. She rose slowly, scarcely trusting her breath. When the knock came, a firm, measured sound, she stood motionless. The vicar's wife, startled, went to the door. Through the crack of light, Mary saw him remove his hat, his hair damp with rain, his expression unreadable. He spoke softly, and whatever words he offered, the vicar's wife hesitated only a moment before stepping aside. Mary remained rooted as he entered, his tall frame filling the modest room. "Lady Mary," he said at last, and her name on his lips carried both relief and reproach. "You have made it very difficult to find you." She tried to compose herself, her voice barely a whisper. "You should not have come." "Perhaps," he replied, "but I have never been skilled at obedience when my heart disagrees." She turned from him, her hands trembling against the back of a chair. "Your heart," she said softly, "belongs to a world that would see me ruined a second time. You must go before anyone sees you." He took a step closer, the sound of rain filling the silence between them. "Is that truly what you wish?" "It is what decency demands," she answered, her tone fragile but resolute. "You owe me nothing, Your Grace. Whatever you felt was only a passing kindness, pity perhaps. I have accepted it and moved on." He studied her with quiet intensity, the kind of gaze that stripped away every false pretense. "Do you believe that?" She forced herself to meet his eyes. "Yes." He gave a short, broken laugh. "Then you are far stronger than I am." He removed his gloves, his movements deliberate, revealing hands that bore the faint marks of rains and travel. I have ridden through every mile of rain between London and Hampshire with only one thought in my mind, to see you again and to hear the truth from you, not the words you think you should speak, but the ones you fear to. Her breath caught. Why? Because, he said, his voice low and unsteady, the silence after you left has been louder than any ballroom. I wake each morning expecting to forget, and each night I remember more. You call it pity, but it is the only thing that has kept me alive. His words disarmed her. The walls she had built within herself, of duty, shame, and propriety, wavered like candle flame. Still, she clung to them. You speak as if affection were an act of rebellion, she said. In our world it is, he answered. Every rule we obey demands that we love only within our rank, that we marry for alliance, not feeling. I have obeyed that world my entire life, and it has left me hollow. The wind struck the windows, a violent rush of sound that seemed to echo her heartbeat. You should not say these things, she murmured. They will destroy you. He moved closer until the warmth of the fire brushed both their faces. Then let them, he said quietly. I have destroyed enough of myself pretending not to care. Tears gathered in her eyes, though she tried to hide them. You think me noble for resisting, she said bitterly, but the truth is far simpler. I ain't worth love, not yours, not anyone's. The room fell utterly still. Then, to her disbelief, he sank to one knee before her, rain still dripping from his coat. The gesture was not theatrical, it was surrender. Then let it be my disgrace to love you, he said, his voice breaking on the words. Mary stared at him, the world narrowing to the sound of rain and his breathing. Every boundary between them, title, station, pride, seemed to dissolve. She wanted to believe him, wanted to reach for the hand that trembled slightly where it rested upon his knee. Yet the weight of reality pressed down, cruel and heavy. You cannot mean it, she whispered. He rose slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. I mean every word. You may think yourself unworthy, but I have never seen such courage in any court or council. You stood against ridicule and never once lowered your head. Tell me how that is unworthy. Her voice trembled. You see courage where there was only survival. Survival is courage, he said simply. And it is what drew me to you when the rest of the world turned away. The clock ticked softly in the corner, the storm easing outside as though the night itself held its breath. Mary could find no words. She felt both terrified and alive, as though she were standing on the edge of something vast and unknown. Finally, she said, almost to herself, if the world knew you were here, they would condemn us both. He smiled faintly. Then let the world do what it will. I have already made my choice. She looked at him then, not as a duke, but as a man stripped of pretense, vulnerable and certain. For a moment she allowed herself to imagine it, a life not ruled by judgment or station, but by the quiet truth between two hearts. It was a fragile dream, one she dared not speak aloud. When he reached for her hand, she did not pull away. Their fingers met, warm against the fading chill. No promises were spoken, yet everything essential had been said. Outside, the storm broke into silence, leaving only the steady rhythm of rain upon the roof, a rhythm that sounded, to her aching heart, like the beginning of something irreversible. Far away, thunder rolled once more, distant but returning. She knew this peace would not last. London's world would not rest. Yet for now, in the dim glow of the vicarage fire, she allowed herself one moment of impossible honesty. She looked into his eyes and whispered, barely audible, "Then let love be our ruin." The following morning dawned pale and brittle, as if the storm had stripped the world clean of color. A thin veil of mist hung over the fields, softening the horizon. Lady Merry Whitmore stood at the vicarage gate, her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders, watching the Duke's carriage disappear down the muddy road. He had left before dawn, at her insistence, though his eyes had carried a promise she had no strength to believe. Each word from the night before still echoed in her mind. His confession, his vow, his defiance of the world that defined them both. She wanted to think it all a dream, yet her heart betrayed her, beating still in rhythm with his every word. Life at the vicarage resumed its quiet pattern. She taught, she mended, she smiled when expected. Yet in every quiet moment she felt the shift within herself, a restless awareness that the life she had fled no longer frightened her as much as the thought of losing him did. Days turned into weeks. Letters began to arrive, sealed with his crest. She did not open the first few, but the fifth came with a single pressed violet inside, and her resolve broke. His words were gentle, patient, written not as a duke but as a man stripped of pride. I do not ask you to forgive what the world has done to us, only to let me stand beside you when you face it. By late autumn, whispers began to stir even in the village. A fine carriage seen on the outskirts, a servant with the Ashbourne colours lingering by the chapel. She had known this would come. Secrets, in England, were currency and poison alike. When the vicar's wife took her aside one morning with concern in her eyes, Mary knew what must be done. She packed her few belongings, folded the letter into her sleeve, and left without farewell. If the Duke wished to risk ruin, she would not let it be at her expense. She travelled north toward Whitmore Hall, her childhood home now shuttered and quiet. It was no longer hers, sold to pay her father's debts, but it stood still, a ghost of everything she had lost. As her carriage approached the gates, she was met by an unexpected sight. The Duke's horse stood tethered outside, its coat glistening with frost. Her breath caught. Before she could speak, he stepped from the shadow of the old oak tree. "Mary," he said softly, her name a prayer. She froze. "You should not be here." "Nor should you," he replied with a faint, rueful smile. "Yet here we both are." He took a step toward her, his eyes steady despite the chill wind. "You ran again." "I had no choice," she answered. "You cannot lose everything because of me." He looked at her, his expression grave but unyielding. "Do you truly believe I have anything worth keeping without you in it?" She shook her head, tears brimming. "You speak as if love were enough to defy the crown, the court, and the gossip of every titled fool in London." "It is not." "It is," he said quietly, "if we are willing to bear the weight of it." For a long moment neither moved. The winter light fell through the bare branches, touching the ruined stones of the hall. He took her hand, his glove damp with cold, and placed something within her palm, a ring, simple and unadorned. "This was my mother's," he said. "It was meant for duty, but I give it now for choice." Her fingers trembled around it. "You cannot," she whispered. "You would be cast out." He smiled faintly. "Then let them cast me out. I have stood in Parliament and bent to kings, but I have never once chosen for myself until now." The words struck through her like light through glass. She felt the ache of every moment she had denied herself the truth. "And if I say no?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Then I will leave," he said simply. "But you will have heard me say it once without shame, that I love you, Merry Whitmore, not as a lady fallen or a scandal survived, but as the only soul who ever saw me as more than my title." Silence followed, broken only by the wind moving through the grass. She looked down at the ring, small against her gloved hand, and felt the weight of the world pressing in from every side, expectation, propriety, fear. And yet, beneath it all, something stronger pulsed, the quiet certainty that she could no longer live in the shadow of what others demanded. She closed her fingers around the ring. "You are a fool," she said softly. "Undeniably," he murmured. "And yet," she went on, her voice trembling with something between laughter and tears, "I find myself unable to let you be one alone." His breath caught the faintest hint of relief in his eyes. Then, she silenced him with a glance, stepping closer until their foreheads almost touched. "No vows, no witnesses," she whispered. "Only truth." He nodded once, as though afraid even movement might break the fragile moment. Only truth. The cold wind swirled around them, but for the first time in years she felt warm. She placed the ring upon her finger, and in that simple gesture, everything shifted. It was not the grand declaration of society's approval, nor the glittering promise of a ballroom proposal. It was quiet, defiant, and real. In the distance, church bells rang from the village below, marking the hour. They stood together, neither speaking. At last she said, with a small, weary smile, "Do you realize what this means?" He met her gaze steadily. "That I am yours, and there is no turning back." Mary laughed softly, the sound carrying on the wind. "Then so be it." The Duke reached for her hand once more, holding it as though anchoring himself to the moment. "Whatever may come," he said, "I would rather face ruin beside you than live untouched by it without you." She looked at him, at the man who had once knelt in the rain and made her believe in the impossible, and saw not a duke, not a savior, but a man who had chosen love over legacy. The storm between them had passed, though the world beyond still waited with its judgment. Yet in that fragile, stolen morning, she felt something she had thought forever lost, peace. And as the first snow began to fall across the empty fields, the world seemed, at last, to forgive them.